Hi, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to see that so many fellow nonprofiteers are interested in the idea of boundaries and just overall creating healthier workplaces. Pardon me, I'm suffering a bit of a cold, so I hope that my coughing and clearing my throat and sipping at tea doesn't distract you too much through this process. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Charity Village for hosting us today and really for doing so much to offer support to people in our sector. Their resources have truly been so valuable to me in my career, so it's really quite an honor to be here alongside them today. So I really believe that healthy boundaries truly make us more productive, both as individuals and as teams and organizations. So today I hope to share some information that you will find useful in creating stronger boundaries for yourself. Oh, and why isn't sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. Ha! First of all, you guys are amazing. Each and every one of you is working so hard to make the world a better place, but I know how hard that can be. There are nights I know that you don't get to eat supper with your family. There are parties that you miss because you're busy stuffing envelopes and finishing the budget. Look, I know you don't stay late because you're curious about what your office building looks like at midnight. You do it because you're dedicated, and boy oh boy, this really can take a toll, can it? If this is sounding familiar and you're sheepishly nodding along, I'm glad you're here because today we're going to be talking about what boundaries are and why those of us who find ourselves working in this amazing sector are particularly vulnerable to having trouble with our boundaries. Then we'll take a closer look at some ways you can start to name and claim your boundaries, and then walk through a couple common workplace scenarios. Hopefully I don't prattle on too long because I hope that we're going to be able to have a really great conversation and discussion afterwards. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about my story. I'm kind of here by mistake. That is, I find myself in this sector after pursuing a film school degree and then getting a degree in medieval English and basically stumbling into a nonprofit organization a decade ago. While my mom was just happy that I could find a job, I ended up absolutely falling in love with the sector and its worldview, which very much mirrors my own. 3 years ago, I started my own consulting company, and I focus on what I do best, which is helping nonprofits find simple, powerful language to tell incredible stories to their donors, members, volunteer, staff, and communities. But all this time, I've harbored a dark secret. Hello, my name is Sheena Greer, and I have boundary issues. I've struggled with boundaries my entire life, but along the way, I've learned some really valuable lessons. And I think, hey, who better than to lead a conversation about boundaries than someone who's totally screwed up along the way? I preface all of this by saying I'm not an HR professional, a psychologist, or a behavioral scientist. I'm just a woman who has been in the sector for a decade, and I believe that each one of us has the power to contribute to a solution for our sector. So there are 4 reasons why I think I have boundary issues. We'll just start with this for now. My natural disposition is to care. If we want to get into Myers-Briggs speak, I'm an INFP, which is the healer. I'm driven to bring peace and tranquility to my loved ones, and I strive to make the world a better place. And because of this, I often keep quiet and do what I feel needs to be done for the greater good. I also have an overdeveloped empathy bone. I like to joke and say that maybe my mom ate a lot of like canned tuna or swallowed a radioactive spider while she was pregnant with me, and this caused me to overdevelop my sense of empathy. Because of this, I'm compelled to be generous and helpful, and often to a fault. I've also always been viewed as the responsible one. I was the youngest in my family and the only girl, so I often ended up being the caretaker for my brothers and my dad. I'm often a voice of reason for people around me, and people know they can count on me, even if it's maybe not appropriate for them to do so. I want to solve problems, and because of this, I can be a bit of a mess magnet. I swoop in to save the day, and eventually people realize that they could come to me for help whether I should be solving their problems or not. Um, I don't mean to sound like I'm complaining or explaining away my own eccentricities. All of these ideas have come from some very deep soul searching around my own boundary issues. And, you know, today I fully recognize my own whys, and I hope that through this presentation I can offer you maybe some ways to get some insight into your whys. But before we dig into some deeper definitions around what boundaries are, I want to have a quick pause and take a poll. A simple question: do you think you have boundary issues? Yes or no?
Fantastic. So everybody, you should see the poll open on your screen now, and I see a bunch of you are going ahead and voting. Just go ahead and click on either yes or no. And I'm just going to let a few more people vote here. Good. Looks like we've got just about everyone. So I'm just going to share those results. And Sheena, perhaps not surprising, looks like most of us have boundary issues.
Yes, yeah, not surprising at all. And that's, I assume that you wouldn't come to a webinar on boundaries if you're like, I have no boundary issues. I'm just going to sit here and listen for an hour. So let's dive deeper into what boundaries actually are, with, hey, a big long slide full of text. Here's a rough and loose definition of boundaries. They're guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify for themselves what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave around them, and how they'll respond when someone steps out of those limits. They're built on a mix of personal beliefs, opinions, attitudes, past experiences, and social learning. Boundaries are critical for a number of reasons. So first, they help us build strong relationships. A good fence makes a great neighbor. And it's not about building really huge walls around yourself, but it's about understanding and communicating where you stand and letting the other people around you know where you stand. Boundaries increase productivity because they create transparency. If you're clear about who you are and where you stand, and people on your team are able to do the same, the conversations about the work you're doing will be more transparent, and you're going to be able to do better work together. In conjunction to this, boundaries help build accountability within the team. Boundary issues often go hand in hand with blame-heavy workplaces, so strong boundaries can help combat this. Boundaries help teams focus on shared goals and expectations. So if we have weak boundaries, others' expectations of us can be completely out of whack. So if we work to promote better boundaries, we can work harder together to meet our organization's goals. Boundaries set people at ease, especially you. If you have boundary issues at work, you're probably really stressed because you're taking on way too much stuff and you're doing too many things. You're saying yes when you should really say no. And this is stressful, and you're probably a lot less effective because of it, right? Not to say you're not awesome at your job, but you could be a lot more awesome if you weren't so stressed out. Of course, they improve overall communication because people know exactly where everyone stands and what's expected of them. We can talk more freely and honestly when our boundaries are in check. It also helps prevent workplace bullying, which I think is unfortunately an all too common problem. If you or others have weak boundaries, it's unfortunate, but there seems like there's always someone who'll be able to take advantage of that and push you around, or they'll get away with all kinds of stuff that should never be tolerated in the workplace. A team full of yes men isn't going to be a team that's very independent thinkers. So if we want to set the course to solve some of our world's most wicked problems, which is what we're doing in the sector, we need a group of strong, passionate, independent thinkers. And people who often have trouble delegating tasks probably have boundary issues of their own. But knowing where your circle is drawn will allow you to see what tasks should be shared with others around you, what are yours, and what are completely someone else's. And finally, boundaries just help minimize misunderstandings, and this saves so much time. If we can clearly communicate who we are, what we need, where we stand, we can spend less time wading through muddy waters of unclear directions or confused lines of communication. So there are 4 flavors, I guess, of personal boundaries. So a person with soft boundaries, their boundaries and ideas merge completely with other people around them and other people's boundaries. They don't really have any of their own. They sort of just go with the flow. People with spongy boundaries are sometimes unsure of what to let in and what to keep out. So they sort of shift between maybe being too rigid or too soft, and they haven't found their place. A person with rigid boundaries is super closed or walled off so that no one can get close to them emotionally or physically. But a person with flexible boundaries, which is what we kind of want to aim for, they decide what to let in and what to keep out. They keep their boundaries in place, but they know themselves well enough to know when they maybe need to be a little bit more rigid or a little bit more flexible. There are several areas where boundaries apply in our life. So material boundaries determine whether you give or lend things out. Money, car, clothes, books, food, your toothbrush, or whatever. Physical boundaries pertain to your personal space, your privacy, and your body. You know, are you a handshake kind of person or a hug? Who do you initiate that kind of contact with, and when? Mental boundaries apply to your thoughts, values, and opinions. Are you easily suggestible? Do you know what you believe, and do you stick to your opinions if you're challenged? Emotional boundaries distinguish separating your emotions and responsibility from someone else's. Healthy emotional boundaries prevent you from giving too much advice or blaming or too easily accepting blame. They protect you from feeling guilty from someone else's negative feelings. Sexual boundaries protect you and your comfort level with overly physical or sexual touch. What, when, where, whom, and all of that kind of stuff. And spiritual boundaries relate to your beliefs and experiences in connection with a higher power. So when our boundaries are violated, it can often be a confusing mix of these different kinds of boundaries. I mean, maybe sometimes it's one or another, but usually it's a mix. And this makes violations difficult to put your finger on sometime. You know, has someone ever said something to you that made you feel really uncomfortable or upset, but you had trouble defining just why? Or worse yet, is when you're explaining this to someone, you're trying to explain it to them, and they don't get why it's such a big deal, and their reaction makes you feel really silly for feeling that way. So every person is slightly different, but you ultimately define the relationships of those who fill your world. You know, who gets to be closest to you and who you sort of keep at bay. But for those with boundary issues, we sometimes confuse this distance, and when a violation occurs, this distance is stripped away. You know, at one time or another, I'm sure that we've all experienced boundary issues, and if each and every one of you said that you feel like you have boundary issues, I guess this is maybe just a little checklist to review. Here are some signs that you might have a boundary issue. And you don't need to chat this in or anything, but if you have a piece of paper handy, I'd like you to just take a little tally of every time you say yes to one of these questions. You don't need to share it or anything, but it's just a little exercise to keep you mindful as we go. So, do you say yes when you mean no? Do you feel guilty for saying no? Do you often act against your beliefs or stay quiet to keep the peace? Do you overgive because you feel like that's what you need to do to feel useful? Do you allow yourself to be interrupted to sort of immediately fill the needs of other people? I know as a mom, I'm constantly being interrupted and leaving what I'm doing, no matter how important it is, to do something for my kids. Allowing yourself to be overly involved in the problems of other people. And ultimately, do your needs come second to other people's needs and to an overall result? do you not express yourself if someone says something that you find offensive? And do you accept physical touch when you don't want it? So just in your own minds, just look at how many times you said yes. Um, I feel like I've worked on a lot of these issues, but I know that I still say yes to a lot of these, you know, depending on what day it is and depending on how strong and solid I am in my own boundaries that day. But I'm here to tell you that you're not alone. Clearly, if everyone on this webinar says that they feel it, and probably if you talk to anyone in person in the workplace, they probably feel it too. Over the past few years, I've had so many conversations with people who work in our sector who have expressed really deep concern over the boundary issues that they face. It feels like it's one of those like overarching sector issues, like conversations around overhead or something, that just keep coming up and yet somehow remains the elephant in the room. But I think in having these conversations and admitting there's a problem, we can obviously, you know, start to get to the roots of that problem and hopefully drive for a solution, not just for ourselves, but, you know, for the sector as a whole. So all of this begs me to ask the question, why are boundary issues such a huge problem for people who work in our sector? You know, it's a really tough problem. It's a really hard question, but it's one that I've thought of a lot. And I really think it comes down to the mix of individuals who are coming to work in our sector and the systems that our sector has in place to get work done. Let's unfold this a little bit. So, what kinds of words are used to describe people who work in our sector? A do-gooder, a hero, passionate, community-minded, bleeding heart, humanitarian, selfless, just to name a few. So just another quick sort of fun poll here. Have any of these words or phrases been used to describe you in the past? And maybe all of them have been.
Awesome. Thanks, Sheena. So we've got another fun poll up here today. If you'd like to go ahead and vote on your screen. Yeah, it's looking like we've got quite a few people voting. We'll wait for a few more. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to share these results because they're quite interesting. Quite a spread, Sheena. We've got 8% for do-gooder, 7% for bleeding heart, 39% for passionate, 15% selfless, and 31% all of the above.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I'm sure that there are probably a lot of other words that people have heard in the past used to describe them, and maybe if they want to, they could chat a couple of those funny ones or funny appropriate ones into the chat box if they want to share them. But so the word in this group that's always struck me is the word selfless. When we talk about someone who is selfless, it is often in relation to how they serve the community. But think about it for a minute. What kind of toll does being selfless for a living take on an individual? Certainly from my experience and from experiences shared with me by others, there is almost a literal loss of self. So now I'd like to bring another perspective in, and I think probably a lot of us know who Dan Pallotta is and probably have seen his TED Talk about charity overhead. Well, a few years ago, I stumbled onto a blog post that he wrote for Harvard Business Review. You can easily Google it if you want to read the entire thing. The article is called Nonprofit Pathology. And in it, he takes a deep and perhaps scathing look at people who work in our sector. I'll warn you, if you look it up and read it, it made me really mad the first time I read it. But the more I read it, I forced myself to read it a couple times because I thought, why is this making me so mad? Why am I getting so defensive about this? And I started thinking about it in a different way. So in this article, he says, maybe people get into the compassion business full-time, not because they're more compassionate than others, but because they're codependent. Maybe the driving force is really an inverted narcissism, an unhealthy and unexamined addiction to caretaking or to self-neglect. Ouch! Oh, that feels like such a harsh dig. I don't bring this up because I think it's the answer. I don't think it's the answer in any way. I don't think that we're all a bunch of codependent, self-neglecting caretakers. But this strongly worded article pushes the way we think about ourselves in relation to the jobs we do and our sector. And in it, he asks the most important question of all, which is, at some point we have to ask ourselves why. Why? Why would we choose to go into an industry where our compensation is not tied to our value, where we're constantly told that there are not enough resources with which to fulfill our potential to make a difference? Why would we do that if we really wanted to change things? And why would we choose to work on problems that are so intractable in the first place? What is it in our personalities that draws us to frustratingly difficult, perhaps unsolvable problems? I would like to suggest that the reasons why we're here and why we chose this work are very, very similar to the ways in which we experience boundary problems. And of course, this is looking at my own why here, so I'll pick on myself. I'm here because of that overly developed empathy bone, because my draw to being responsible and wanting to solve problems, my personality just drives me in that direction. I want to help and save and make a difference. And all of these reasons why I'm here are exactly the same reasons why, at the end of the day, I struggle with boundary issues. You know, I think there are compassionate, selfless people in every sector, but I would argue that our sector has the highest percentage. And I feel like, hey, I feel like I'm in the best company imaginable because every day in my work, I get to meet people who are just like me, who are completely driven to make change. And sometimes I also feel, for that same reason, that I'm in dangerous company because we seemingly struggle with the same issues that make us vulnerable. You know, vulnerability is a great thing, but obviously too much of it can cause trouble. So in that article, he also draws Pallotta also draws some quotations from Thomas Merton, this dapper fellow on the screen, who was a 20th century American Catholic mystic and writer. So Merton says, there is a pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist fighting for peace most easily succumbs: activism and overwork. Overwork is violence. Wow, again, very strong words, but again, a statement that I think helps push us and the way that we think about the work we do. He goes on to say, to surrender oneself to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone with everything, is to succumb to this violence. The frenzy of the activist neutralizes his work for peace. So the ways which we come to and are driven to do good things works to neutralize the good work we're trying to do. That's all very meaty, heavy food for thought. But of course, individuals only play a role in this potential for dysfunction. Of course, the systems and beliefs which our sector is built upon also play a role in these issues we face. So what are some common, dare I say, universal nonprofit challenges? No resources, be that people, time, or money, a lack of leadership, or aging leadership that is maybe stuck in another day and age. We are dealing with the world's most wicked problems: poverty, hunger, disease, displacement, racism, inequality, sexism, to name a few. Pay inequality between our sector and the business sector, and between individuals within the sector itself. A full menu of dysfunction, from misaligned board right down to the old broken computer monitors that we're forced to use on a daily basis. Silos, lack of support, misconceptions. These are just a few, but I'm certain that as we sort of went through this list, some very specific and close to home examples popped into your head. And herein lies what I think is a really vicious cycle. Notice how many of these issues are about systems of contribution, whether it's money, time, people, effort. These issues are set up to require contribution. And I think that this is a problem. I think this is a huge problem. Because if people come to work in this field and they're prone to give, and the system which allows our sector and continues to have our sector moving along require deep contribution, the cycle is just going to continue. We're going to keep giving things to systems that need to take from us to survive, to thrive. Hardworking, well-meaning, passionate people like you and me are just going to keep giving. And of course, at the end of the day, we do get something in return. Each and every one of us, I'm sure, feels really great about the work we get to do. We're passionate and we're community-minded. But how long can we let that be our northern star if the work itself is completely burning us out? That's a lot of heavy thought, and I don't mean to depress you or cause a, like a Homer Simpson-like freak out. Obviously, we can't fix that broken system in an hour, but there is a way that each of us today can go back to our desks and start healing ourselves and giving ourselves opportunity to stop this cycle in big and small ways. And really, the way to do this is to step up and to name and claim our boundaries and work towards mitigating boundary violations. So before I start, though, I have another quick poll. I just want to get a sense of how many people there are out there that are actively practicing some kind of self-reflection. So like journaling, meditating, a support group, or something else.
Wonderful. So at this point, you guys know the drill. Go ahead and vote on your screen, and we'll just give it a few seconds and let a few more people join in. Great, thanks everyone. So let's share these results. So Sheena, looks like 10% journaling, 20% meditation, 18% support systems, 18% other, and 33% not currently doing any form of self-reflection.
Okay, cool. Well, that's, it's great to hear that so many people out there have something in place to reflect on their days and their lives. I think all too often we, for some reason, try to separate our personal selves from our work selves, but I think in this sector we really can't do that. And that's a topic for another webinar, another time maybe, but it's really good to see that people out there are practicing some self-reflection. So let's do some work now. I think there are 13 steps towards better boundaries, but this is by no means any kind of roadmap. It's really the practice of mindfulness that's really woven into how we live. And obviously, as I walk through these ideas, by no means are you supposed to be like scribbling madly at your desk trying to complete them as we go. I hope that you will take what you can from this and take it back home or to the office with you and take the time to start working through some of the exercises and thinking about the questions.
And Sheena, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt there just for 1 second and just remind everybody that we are recording the session, and you are also going to get a copy of Sheena's slide deck as well. So just on that note of not needing to take frantic notes as Sheena goes through these 13 steps.
Cool. So step 1, know thyself. It's difficult to set good boundaries if you don't have a clear sense of where you end and the world around you begins. Who you are, what you're capable of, and willing to give must be clear if you're going to set boundaries that will work for you. There are many things that you can do to begin this work, but here's just a little exercise to get you started. First, try making a list of your core values. Who are you? What do you believe? What do you need? And what do you want? And then think about your own whys. Why are you in this field? Make as big a list as you can think of. And then take some time to think about how these whys, how your own whys may be connected to some of the boundary issues that you're facing. Step 2, shift your mind. Really begin with the idea that having personal boundaries is okay. It doesn't mean that you're selfish or unloving. It's both completely acceptable and absolutely necessary for healthy relationships. Understand that self-worth comes from defining your life as you want it to be, not from the acceptance or identity of others. So this exercise is really simple, and maybe you can do this like out loud with me in your office right now. Okay, repeat after me. It's perfectly okay and absolutely acceptable to have boundaries. It's perfectly okay and absolutely acceptable to have boundaries. There we go. So next step is to start defining your boundaries. Sit down and think about how you've been allowing others to maybe take advantage of you or step across your lines. How you might be accepting situations that, you know, are really unacceptable to you. So start by making a list of your current boundaries. Do you have any? I know sometimes it doesn't feel like we have a lot, but I'm sure that there are some things that, you know, maybe you've always been very strong and been able to speak to, while maybe some boundaries have weakened over time. Maybe you started your job and really, you know, said, hey, I'm not going to answer emails after work. But then, you know, one thing led to another, and you started to. So think about those boundaries. And then I want you to make a list of 5 things you'd like to stop doing. This could be any, or pardon me, 5 things you'd like people to stop doing to you. So this could be anything from barging into your office, calling useless meetings, or getting too close in your personal space. Then make a list of 5 things you'd like people to stop doing to people around you. You know, have you witnessed some workplace bullying? Maybe there's a really pushy board member who every time she comes into the office is super rude to the office admin. Something like that. Finally, make a list of 5 things you will no longer tolerate people saying to you. This could be anything from, you know, that playful nickname that actually really gets on your nerves, or, you know, making jokes or playful teasing. Whatever that is, take some time to make those lists. So next, you're going to need to communicate your boundaries. Communicate these things that you've been thinking about and things that you've, you know, been constructing in your mind. If you never express what they are, you can't expect people to know what they are. So start first by making a list of people who have maybe violated boundaries in the past or whose interactions with you have made you feel somehow uncomfortable. Think about it and then try to define that violation. Okay, was it a physical, mental, emotional? What kind of mix was it? Try to define, you know, and allow yourself to define, okay, you know, this person violated my emotional and mental space, or, you know, this person keeps, you know, barging into my office, and that's, you know, an emotional and physical violation. Whatever it is, allow yourself the space to define it. And then start thinking of ways to just initiate those conversations. This is probably going to take time, and you know, you're going to have to build up some courage. And I would also say to expect that this will likely be difficult. It's easy for us to just not make waves, not speak up. But that doesn't help us in the long run, right? We get stressed and we come home and we have to like purge, you know, all the stuff that happened in the office. When we could have just said, you know what, I really don't like when you interrupt me when I'm on the phone, or, you know, whatever that happens to be. But if you've never communicated like that before, people will probably be a little shocked by your honesty. So expect that this conversation will probably be a little uncomfortable, especially if you've generally been viewed as a people pleaser, and you probably have. So many of us are naturally people pleasers. So there's probably going to be defensiveness, pushback, but that's okay because they'll get used to it. They will. So prepare yourself for violations because they're bound to happen. People make mistakes, but when someone steps over a line we've created, don't be surprised by it, just be prepared for it. It's helpful to visualize your boundaries getting crossed and how you're going to handle those situations when they arise. For instance, your boss emails you on Saturday and this is something you've asked her not to do. Visualize processing your reaction and create a plan of action. Will you respond right away? Will you respond Monday and say you were with family, or what's your plan? That way, in the moment when something like this comes up, you're not going to be hijacked by your emotions. You'll hopefully be able to handle it much more rationally if you can, you have this protocol in place to refer to when it happens. So, and when it happens, reinforce and discuss violations, when they happen as soon as you can. When boundaries are violated, it's not uncommon for people to, get upset, ruminate, and stew on it for days or weeks, and then maybe bring it up later when it seems like it's not really an issue anymore. It's an issue to you because you're still stewing on it, but that could have happened a long time ago. So do the best that you can to address it promptly. Step up with tact and grace. So inform the person and clearly describe the problem. Define the unacceptable. Let the other party know what about their behavior was not acceptable. Share your emotions. Let other people know how the situation made you feel. Then request the solution you seek. I really need you to stop emailing me on Saturday. And then let them know their alternatives. Obviously, not in an ultimatum type way, but let the other person know what you plan to do if they won't comply with your request. And obviously, as I say, don't be threatening about it. As much as it's hard to do this, it's important, because if you don't let them know that there's an alternative, they might just keep doing it. So be direct, transparent, and concrete. I also suggest that you watch the number of apologies you use when you're doing this. There's a difference between saying sorry when you need to be sorry and saying sorry when you feel like there may be some negative repercussion for standing up for yourself. Learn to use structure in meaningful ways. This means booking a meeting instead of letting a coworker force you into a lunchroom strategy session. This means setting an agenda for the meeting that doesn't include, helping her fix her email client. And this means leaving that meeting with action items. So first, consider the length of your meetings. Are they all sort of like an hour when they could be 15 minutes? Our calendar's default setting is an hour, but meetings shouldn't be an hour long by default. Do you have agendas? And when you come out, is everyone clear on what they need to do next? I've been to too many meetings where this is just not the case. And what ends up happening is, that meeting ends up having to happen again because no one really knew, well, what was that about and what were we talking about, and I don't really remember what I was supposed to do. So if you use that structure, hopefully that will help keep those boundaries in place. Manage your time. I'm not saying you're not good at managing your time. I just know that if you're mindful about how you're using your time, not only will this do wonders for your productivity, but it also gives you a clear sense of, hey, what you need to do the job and, who you need to help make that happen. And let me say, when you've maximized the use of your time, it's going to be a lot harder for others to take it from you. So reward and be thankful. Be sure you acknowledge and reward those who are supporting and respecting your personal boundaries. Thank them and let them know what a positive impact it's been on your life. This is going to motivate them to continue their behavior. It's going to make them feel good that they helped you out. Reciprocate. Remember that respecting boundaries goes two ways. Examine your own behavior and words to see where you might be crossing another person's lines. Work to change those behaviors so that you're reflecting the respect and support that you want for yourself. And you may be wondering why this step comes so late, but I think it has to for a reason. This is an instance where success will really rely on you being able to put yourself first sometimes. So if you start by examining other people's boundaries and how you might not be giving them what they need, there's a great chance that it's going to continue to infringe on your own boundaries. stay flexible. The goal is a healthy relationship with those people you work with, really balanced by a sense of understanding, support, and give and take. And there's going to be occasions when you choose to bend your boundaries or allow someone to cross a line. If someone's hurt or sad or needs extra support and asks for it, respectfully and kindly, these are times to show flexibility. And as you gain confidence around your boundaries, you will know when and how best to bend them. Be patient. This doesn't happen overnight. Be gentle with yourself when you recognize that you've slipped up and allowed someone to take something that you weren't willing to give. When you go ahead and you answer that email on that Saturday night when you told yourself that you didn't want to do that anymore and you've communicated that. Don't be too hard on yourself if you slip up. This is going to happen. Trust your instincts and feelings about what you do and don't want in your life. And hey, if something comes along that doesn't feel right, if something's bothering you, there is a reason. It's unfortunate that we live in this world where even though we're born with these incredible instincts, we're taught almost immediately to squash them. And I think especially for women who are told to smile and relax and made to feel as though we're somehow broken if we're not constantly smiling and relaxing. And do your best, and this is where that the whole process of self-reflection, whatever it is for you, comes into play over and over. You need to revisit this on a regular basis. Once you've started developing your boundaries, reassess where you've placed them. One way to ensure your boundaries are healthy and flexible is to just take the time to think about what you've done. What's worked well? What hasn't? Where does more need to be done? Have you become too rigid? Are you still, needing a little bit more to give yourself what you need in terms of that? So those are 13 steps, but unfortunately you can do a lot of work on yourself, and that obviously doesn't happen overnight. It's hard and it takes hard work, and it also doesn't automatically change the people that you work with. So let's take just a few minutes to look at some just sort of really common workplace problems. Of course, there's nothing that's prescriptive. I have no prescriptive answers here, but these are just sort of some overarching problems. So, that squeaky team member. Maybe they talk a lot or invade your space without knocking. They monopolize meeting time. They always seem to find a way to make their mandate more important than everyone else's. Maybe they're gossipy or like to nose in on your job, or maybe quite simply, your personalities don't jive. You just aren't a really good fit, but over time, you've just started to find them insufferable on every level, to the point that how they sip their coffee sends your blood pressure soaring. And unfortunately, this happens because we haven't communicated, we haven't taken the space that we've needed to create a healthy workspace that works for us, in relation to the teams we have. We spend a lot of time with our coworkers, and we need to be able to get along. So if you start by keeping your own personal boundaries in check, this is going to do wonders. And, learn to flex your diplomacy muscles and advocate for appropriate boundaries in the workplace environment. Even if this is, calling a meeting to talk about workplace boundaries and that kind of thing, and trying to have a conversation, if that's appropriate in your workplace. Obviously, it's not always, but take the time to create your boundaries and express them, and hopefully this rubs off on the people around us. So does that look like anyone's org chart? I've worked at a few organizations that felt like a bowl of spaghetti. So you got hired, and likely along the way you've picked up a few extra tasks because simply they needed to get done, or maybe it was just easier to do it yourself. But the problem lies in when you start breaking these tasks down and you realize that you're doing someone else's job, or you're doing all of this stuff that is not allowing you to do your job. If you have the opportunity, review your job description on a regular basis, if you were given one. You know, look at the one you were given upon hire, if that's all you have, or the latest version, if you can find one, and compare it to the stuff you're actually doing. If it's out of sync and you can talk to your supervisor or manager about it, you know, I suggest having that conversation. And if you can't, if that's just not a possibility, try to see where you can start whittling it down. You know, are you the major gifts officer, but for some reason you're also in charge of ordering office supplies? You know what? Try just stopping it. Stop it. Let the paper and the whiteout run out. You know, when people blow a gasket, which they might, the issue of whose job is it to handle facilities and supplies anyways will hopefully be dealt with, and hopefully it won't just fall back on you or some other poor, undeserving, you know, already too busy fool. Isn't it funny how we live in a world that's disgustingly connected and we still don't know what the heck is going on across the hall? Fundraisers don't know what communications is doing. Communications don't know what programs are doing. And meanwhile, the ED has told you that none of this really matters, or hasn't told you that none of this matters because, you know, they're going to scrap the whole thing. It happens all too often. So be transparent about the work you're doing. If the chain of communications is broken, you know, make your own. If you see, hear, or do something that you know is going to affect someone else, use the appropriate communications channel to connect. Useless meetings. We all know too much about this. So again, go back to using that structure and saying no and insist. So one of two things is going to happen. Your eager insistence to make meetings suck less will actually make them suck less, or you'll be such a pain in the butt that people might actually stop inviting you to their useless meetings. When we find ourselves in situations where our leadership is causing issues, this is a really difficult one, and there's no, I mean, none of these problems have easy solutions, but leadership is definitely a tricky one. And I would just say, you know, as much as you can, try to lead from the bottom up or the middle out, or from wherever you are. Leadership isn't about titles, it's about asking good questions, being smart, and setting a good example, you know, with your actions for others. And a part of that is those healthy boundaries. And if it happens to be a board member, and we've probably all been in a situation where maybe a governance board tried to get a little bit too up in your grill and get you like typing letters for them. I actually had that happen. Try to put another board member or your ED between you and the problem, because ultimately if this is trickling down, they need to deal with it. Workplace bullying is a massive issue, and again, we could talk forever about it, but it's wild. So in this book by Bob Sutton, and pardon my language here, the book is called The No Asshole Rule. He looks at workplace bullying issues, and he's laid out sort of this dirty dozen of things that people do to bully other people. And each and every single one of these are a boundary violation. We can't ban bullies. You know, I think that's what Mr. Sutton wants to do, and he talks about that in his book. I think it's hard to ban them, but I think that when we set strong personal boundaries, this helps combat the effects of workplace bullying. And I would go even further to say that stronger boundaries are great for you, but they're also great for making that system we work in safer for others. We can't, you know, fix other people or the organization, and that's not our job. But if you can make your boundaries stronger and you can show other people that that is possible, that's going to make your workplace better. I think that if we had a stronger sense of where we end and our jobs begin, maybe we'd be, you know, if we were more willing to voice our opinions and feelings when we see something is wrong, I think that ultimately that's just going to go so far in helping make our workplaces better and helping our sector be more productive. So let's just do a really quick review. This was a lot of stuff that I probably could have gone on for a lot longer about. boundaries are really critical for ensuring that you feel safe, sane, and productive at your job, and flexible boundaries help keep us strong and resistant. For many different reasons, people who work in our sector seem to be prone to having these boundary issues, and it's a vicious cycle when the system we're in requires constant and increasing contribution. Naming and claiming our boundaries takes time, persistence, and patience, but ultimately it is the most important thing you will do if you want to find some peace for yourself at your job. And finally, setting those strong personal boundaries really does help in terms of making things better for everyone, I think. I think if each of us work towards setting better personal boundaries, this could start, this could change our organization, and it could start shifting things in our sector a bit. So finally, this was a lot, and I'm looking at my clock, and I hope we have some time for some questions. But I do invite you to keep in touch in other ways too, if we can't get to your question today or anything like that. So send me an email, find me on Twitter, reach out, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you in any way that you would like to. But that's the end of that. So I hope that maybe there are some questions out there in the I think 10 minutes that we have left.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sheena. We do have some really good questions, so we're going to get to as many as we can today. I'd like to start out with an acronym that you had mentioned in your 13 steps, the IDSRS.
Right.
So perhaps you could just revisit that quickly.
Absolutely. So that's inform the person, define the unacceptable, share your emotions, request the solution, and let them know of their alternatives. And it's so funny that I missed that because I really hate acronyms. As I'd like to champion myself as a huge fan of plain language. So I really don't like acronyms, and I apologize for that.
Oh, that's great. We just had a couple of questions on that. I think a lot of people were paying close attention through those 13 steps, but as you said, that was a lot of information to cover. So that's great. And would you say, Sheena, that a flexible boundary is a more mature form of a spongy boundary?
I think the difference between a flexible boundary and a spongy boundary is that someone with a spongy boundary might not have a clear understanding of their own boundaries. They oscillate between being too soft or too rigid, and they haven't really thought about why. And I think a person who has really great flexible boundaries has taken some more time to carefully consider, why they have these boundaries in place, and in what circumstances, do they need to be more rigid or more flexible, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Great. And what would you suggest as the best way to understand other people's boundaries? Should you ask them straight out? Should you be reading behavior? What are some clues that you can look for?
I think that people do give clues in terms of just the way they react to certain things. And of course, it's the greatest power that we have in understanding other people in general, whether it's to understand their boundaries or when it comes to fundraising or whatever it is. We need to be better listeners. We need to be active listeners. So if we're paying attention to people around us, and I would say that people in our sector probably have a pretty high propensity for emotional intelligence and being able to connect to other people, but we're often too busy to listen, or we've sometimes forgotten how. So I would start by simply being more mindful of the people around you. And you know what? If you think it warrants a conversation, if someone seems really rigid, or if someone's constantly, hopping up and sort of, being too much of a yes man, you don't need to be like really harsh about it, but like grab a coffee with your coworker and say, like, you don't need to do all this stuff that you're doing. Wow, you're really doing a lot. Like, are you are you feeling okay? Like, do you want to talk about it? Just start there. And, ultimately, if they don't have a really good sense on their boundaries, they're not going to be able to very clearly communicate with you. But hopefully if you get a sense that they're maybe struggling, that, you can just have a conversation with them and see how, you might be able to offer help without going out of your way to do too much, because of course you don't need to solve all of their problems.
There would be a boundary issue in itself.
Absolutely.
Great. And when working with clients, and maybe particularly at-risk clients, it can be really tough balancing empathy and boundaries. Do you have any tips on that?
Wow, I think that that's a really tough one, and my programming experience was a decade ago, so I haven't had a lot of experience dealing directly with other, well, like with clients in that way, but I would say that you know, there's I guess there's a difference between doing something for someone and doing help, working alongside someone to get it done. Are you obviously, someone is whatever their background is, and they need a lot of help. Ultimately it's your job to help them find those resources and use them for themselves. At the end of the day, obviously you can't make someone, seek further counseling or potentially like leave an abusive home, or whatever the situation might be. And I can imagine that that would be a really difficult situation to bounce in, but yeah, I don't know if I have a really great answer for that.
No,
Sorry.
that's great. And how would you be able to tell if your boundaries are reasonable or perhaps are too rigid?
Um, I think to start with reasonable, I would just ask yourself, how do you feel about the work you're doing? Are you overwhelmed? Do you feel like there's constantly a huge list of people and a huge list of needs that you need to fulfill? If you're feeling like that, it takes some time to think about, okay, what needs am I fulfilling and for whom, and is this reasonable? Um, that's where I'd start in terms of trying to figure out whether they're healthy or not. In terms of being too rigid, that's it's hard for me to speak to because I probably have been too rigid in the past, but I think that I mean is I guess maybe it comes down to asking other people, is this unreasonable? If people get upset with you, for making a decision to do or not do something, like, is this reasonable? Bounce it off, and that's where that self-reflection and maybe, that good group of friends, or a spouse, or a group of other people who work in the sector, asking them, like, am I crazy for saying no to this? And seek some other opinions. Ultimately, it's your own choice. If you decide you don't want to do that, you decide you don't want to do that.
Wonderful. And I think we'll just finish off because we're getting close to time here with one last question, which is a really great one from an organizational perspective. Do you have any tips on how to create an environment of openness within an organization so that people can really talk about these types of things?
I think that's a that's a huge that's a question about like overall organizational culture, right? And obviously we all want to have and promote organizations that are are safe for the people who are working in them, that aren't, asking too much. And but ultimately, of course, a lot needs to get done with very little. So, that vicious cycle of, people who really want to do good, with an unlimited number of good things that need to get done and a limited amount of resources. It's a really tricky thing to create that culture, that healthy culture within an organization. And um, I think in terms of where to start on boundaries and making sure that people are feeling respected. If you're the leadership, if you're in a leadership position in an organization, start with hey, you can start as simply as looking at people's job descriptions with them and trying to help them, okay, you've got all these tasks that are really not yours, and although we don't really have another role for that, is there a way that we can reasonably shift this for you so you're not feeling so stressed? And as you start to do that on an individual level, you can also have conversations, in the group that's hopefully, not blaming and shaming around, the work you need to do together and what's absolutely necessary and what kinds of things are much less important. Obviously, we kind of, at the end of the day, we feel like everything's important and it's really hard to prioritize. But if you're in a leadership position and you're able to help your staff prioritize around the work they need to get done, that will help them attain those boundaries.
That's wonderful. That's a great tip, Sheena. Thank you so much for a really great presentation. Lots of good information there that I think all of us today can get some really good takeaways from. So thank you very much. Before we sign off, I want to remind everyone that we are going to follow up with you by email tomorrow with the webinar recording and the presentation slides. We're also going to include a link to a short survey. If you could take 5 minutes to fill it out, it's really helpful for us. It helps us further refine our future webinar content and our delivery. You'll have an opportunity to let us know if there's any topics you'd like to see covered in a future session as well. And I'd also like to mention that our next webinar is coming up on November 26th. We're going to have the Canadian Mental Health Association of BC presenting on mental health in the nonprofit workplace. So somewhat of a continuation of the type of topic that we were talking about today. There will be a link in the email that you receive tomorrow for more information and to register for that. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today, for all your questions and comments. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we see you again soon. Thanks.